Greetings, sisters and brothers. Welcome to Hearts of Darkness, my podcast. I'm your host, Milton Alimadi. What is Hearts of Darkness? Hearts of Darkness is a podcast which explores why Africa historically has been viewed as the antithesis of civilization. So the podcast is going to start by readings and a discussion from my book of the same title, Hearts of Darkness, How White Writers Created the Racist Image of Africa. I'm going to be publishing the third edition of this book in April 2020. The first edition was published in 2003, the second edition in 2016. So today I'll discuss the purpose of the book and I'll read from a chapter from the book. And over the next several weeks, you will be hearing me reading and discussing each chapter from the book. The book's summary is this thesis: that historically, Africa was demonized in Western media in order to justify, in the first place, the enslavement of Africans. So in other words, the West had to create a narrative which would justify the enslavement of other human beings. So obviously they had to be depicted as less than human beings, as subhumans, and that justified the first narrative. The second narrative was to justify the conquest and colonization of Africa in the 19th century by the European powers, led by countries such as Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal, Italy, Spain, and Germany. These were the primary countries that conquered and colonized the continent of Africa. They had a conference in Berlin, 1884-85, the Berlin Conference. The third narrative occurred in the post-colonial period. The demonization of Africa and Africans, and by extension, Africa diaspora all over the world, was to exonerate the crimes that had been committed during the enslavement regime and during the conquest and colonization. So in other words, the narrative continued saying, Africans do not deserve independence. And that justifies the continuation of Western interference in the internal affairs of African countries. In the 1960s, the focus was on what had been the Belgian Congo, now called the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And as recently as 2011, it was to justify the Western intervention in Libya. So over the next several weeks, when you hear readings from my book, you'll get a better understanding, and you'll realize that the demonization of Africa was by no accident. It was by calculated design. And the continued demonization of Africa in the 21st century is also a calculated design. So let me now read from the first chapter of my book. And then I'll pause also for a moment just to discuss the implications of what I've read. The first chapter is entitled Inquiry into the Origin of Black Skin. And what is the meaning of that? That is to show that historically, as far as when Herodotus was writing, the West portrayed blackness of skin as something that was an aberration, because white skin color was considered to be the normal. So all these so-called learned individuals through the centuries wrote and tried to explain why black skin was an aberration and how it appeared in the first place. So let me now read from the book itself, chapter 1. Historically, Western media manufactured and disseminated the predominant image of Africans as savages in order to justify the exploitation of Africans and the plunder of the continent's resources. The objective was to justify the terrible crimes committed against Africans during various stages of history, including the period of enslavement of Africans, the period of European conquest and partition of Africa, the period of colonial regime in Africa, and the neo-colonial period, which includes the contemporary era. The racist representations of Africa were popularized in the Western world through the published journals of the early European travelers, the so-called explorers, who went to Africa to, quote, discover, end quote, landmarks such as lakes, rivers, and mountains, and then to rename those landmarks after the leading European monarchs of their era. These travelers mapped the continent and paved the way for formal European conquest of Africa and colonization. Some, like Samuel Baker, later became colonial governors. In modern times, the depictions of Africans as, quote, backward, end quote, and, quote, primitive, end quote, were disseminated through newspapers, magazines, books, and Hollywood films, including the Stallion series. The demonization of Africans was so pervasive and effective that they became regarded as, quote, savages, end quote, universally in the Americas, in Europe, and in Asia. The negative representations promoted racist white supremacy while diminishing the self-esteem of many Africans on the continent and in the diaspora. The demonization of Africans in Western writing was so effective that today, the Europeans who committed barbaric actions, massacres, rapes, pillage, theft, and enslavement of Africans are regarded as the bearers of civilization and enlightenment, while their African victims are regarded as the ones who were, quote, backward, end quote. What's more, many contemporary writers, including Africans themselves, still view and write about Black people through the prism of bigotry created over the centuries. Some of the most enduring deep-seated stereotypes about Africans, African descendants, and the continent are that the Black inhabitants of the African continent are, quote, barbaric, end quote, and, quote, primitive, end quote. Black people are morally, spiritually, and intellectually inferior relative to.
Hi, I'm Shawnee, and whenever I want to listen to something profound and I'm having a moment, I go to GoPro Radio, the fastest growing network in the galaxy.